Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered at Massey College at the University of Toronto on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this CJF event, part of our Journalism and Democracy, A View From series, which brings prominent figures in conversation with Canadian journalists to help us better understand the forces shaping public life. A heartfelt thank you to Massey College for partnering with us on this event. It is hard to imagine a more fitting setting for a conversation about journalism, democracy, and the public good. We are honored to be here. I'd also like to thank TD Bank Group, our exclusive JTalk series sponsor, for making this conversation possible, and our thanks to Cision, our in-kind supporter. Tonight's conversation could not be more timely. With a new advisory committee on Canada-US economic relations just announced, and amid renewed uncertainty, economic strain, and political intensity, how Canada and the United States understand one another and how the media shapes that understanding feels especially urgent in these times. This evening, we are delighted to present A View from Washington, featuring David Paterson, Ontario's representative in Washington, D.C. David brings a rare vantage point to this discussion. He has spent decades working at the intersection of business, public policy, and international affairs. Before taking on this post in 2023, he led corporate and environmental relations for General Motors of Canada, following senior roles at BlackBerry, where he oversaw government relations and public policy across 175 countries. Earlier in his career, he also helped steer GM Canada through the 2009 auto sector restructuring, experience that gives him an especially grounded perspective on cross-border relations, trade, and the narratives that shape them. He is also a valued past board member of the Canadian Journalism Foundation and proof at the CJF that board service is never truly over. David, we have a way of pulling you back in. David will begin with an opening reflection and will then be joined by Rob Benzie for a conversation exploring the media's role in Canada-US relations, trade coverage, and informed public discourse. Rob is one of Canada's most respected political journalists and always a sharp observer of power, policy, and personality. As the Toronto Star's Queen's Park bureau chief, he spent years helping people across Ontario understand how political decisions shape their lives, and he brings exactly the kind of curiosity, rigor, and wit that this conversation deserves. We are also fortunate that Rob is a member of our board of directors as well. After the discussion, I hope you will stay with us to continue the conversation at the cocktail reception. But for now, please join me in welcoming David Paterson and Rob Benzie.
Thank you, Natalie, and so wonderful to see so many people, some good friendly faces, and even some friends from like grade 6 back there. They are not in grade 6 anymore, but that's where we met. I really have been looking forward to this event for a good long time. I just loved my time on the board of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. I learned so much. And now I feel in Washington, I'm learning even more, given sort of some of the occupant of the White House and some of the things that are taking place there. So I wanted to start off just a little bit before Rob and I get into some Q&A, talking a little bit about about what we do as the representative to Washington, what the role is, and then I will look into my very cloudy crystal ball, and I will be so brave as to try and give a little bit of a sense of how I think things may play out on the trade front, which will get me in all kinds of trouble, especially with this crowd. But I think that's what's kind of on all our minds these days as well. So we'll try and do a little bit about that. But knowing this was a great crowd of people interested in journalism as well, I thought when I talked to Natalie that I would sort of cast my mind back to when I first was asked to go down to Washington. And nobody gives you kind of a guidebook or anything like that. It's just, okay, you're a business guy, go down there and do that. And there's a couple of other people that were down there that could give you a couple of hints, but I found for the next person that eventually does this, there were a couple of books that were really good to read going down there. And the first one, of course, is The Art of the Deal. And, that really is important to read, that think bigly about all things and leverage everything. Leverage is everything. Everything can be leveraged. And, push, 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 continue to push. And then when they push back, push some more. And never, ever admit that you're wrong. And those are really what is in that book, if you ever take the time to read it. And that's probably, it was a good start. I actually went down to Washington a year before the last election. I went to the DNC, the Democratic Republic convention in Chicago. I went to Milwaukee for the Republican one. That was the night when Trump came in with a bandage on his ear. And the second night, literally, there were hundreds of people with bandages on their ear. And I thought, this is like that movie, The Life of Brian, where he holds up his shoe and everybody. And it was a really important experience to experience MAGA and all of its splendor and learn more about it. And I really underline the word learn. You have to learn about that. Other books, there is a book, you can get it on Amazon probably for about $5 right now. It's by Robert Lighthizer, the former negotiator of trade. Really smart fellow. And he wrote a book called No Trade is Free. And really important because I think we have a tendency to feel that this is being done to us, this whole tariff attack. And really to understand why the United States is rethinking trade, why tariffs are important to them is in the essence of that is in that book. It has an awful lot to do with China. It has an awful lot to do with the hollowing out of the Rust Belt, auto jobs going to other places, manufacturing jobs going to other places, and to try and build tariff walls to help protect that. I mean, we think that tariffs sometimes are absolutely new things that have just come out of the pocket from Donald Trump. He's always believed in them. He brought them forward. I'm from the auto sector. The United States has had a 25% tariff on pickup trucks since 1964. They're not new. And in fact, what they're doing is adding to that with an objective. And so very important to understand that, especially if you're going to sit across the table, as I have with the Premier, again, with Lutnick or with Jameson Greer or others, and understand where they're coming from. Some other people might suggest there's a sort of a common thing in Washington right now. People are rereading George Orwell's 1984. And for this crowd, newspeak, doublespeak, every double plus on good types of things from Big Brother, perpetual war. Have another read of that book. It's incredibly prescient and scary in some ways. But I raised that, and I think it's something we'll talk more about too. To be able to do this type of work, it's really important for all of us that are focused on economic things to be able to separate signal and noise in Washington. If you go down every rabbit hole, which are placed by design, you will not be focused on the things that you need to focus on. And even when I go in and I meet with people like wonderful senator from North Dakota, Senator Kramer, he will say, listen, we love Canada. We love doing trade with Canada. It's really important. So listen to what he does, not what he says, and you'll be fine. And so that's the kind of conversation that you get into there. Now, I really do have a couple of friends here, and Professor Watt. He and I were at Queen's University together, and we studied American history. And it was one of the reasons that I was really interested in doing this role. But there is a book, if you are really interested, written by a great American historian named Richard Hofstadter. It's actually an essay that he wrote in 1964 called "The Paranoid Style." And it is a study of how, throughout American history, Americans have always been drawn to conspiracy theories, anxiety, status anxiety on various things, going right back to the witch hunts in terms of taking rather bizarre actions on things, to the McCarthy period, and even thinking today of things like QAnon, which what the heck is that? But it actually fits with a pattern of all kinds of trends in American history where the social fabric of the United States sometimes feels threatened, whether it's by immigrants, by Catholics, by others that came in, and today we see it on the southern border. So all those things were kind of intellectually comforting to me to go down and learn a little bit about the United States, and then you get there. And it is an overwhelmingly impressive experience to be there. We, in the role that I'm in as a Ontario representative, are not in charge of trade. We are there as subnational representatives, and that's quite rare. In fact, I don't know of any other embassy that has subnational representatives in Washington. So people will say, well, why do you have that? And it's because of our Constitution, in a sense. It's sort of like, why do you bring kids to a business meeting? Well, they own the house. And in our case, we do. The provinces in Canada are the owners of our natural resources, our critical minerals, our nuclear power system. All these things are actually in the purview of the province. So, hi, I'm Dave. I'm from Ontario. We have all the critical minerals that China has just cut off. We are de-risking small modular nuclear technology, which you will absolutely require if you're going to do artificial intelligence. And they say, come on in. You're very interesting to us. So for 2 years, what I have done is reach out to American business. I have met with hundreds of American businesses. Everyone from Apple and Amazon and others have been through the office. It is so wonderful to meet them, to hear their story, and we have allies in the American business community, let alone the auto sector, and I had a bit of a head start there. But they want to get back to trade in North America for our mutual self-interest. So when they asked business, what is your opinion on the USMCA? About 100% of them said, we want to see CUSMA or the USMCA renewed. Now, there are issues that need to be dealt with, but we have tremendous allies amongst the business community. We've had a few speed bumps along the way. We had the Supreme Court decision, and then we saw Trump sort of fill that with a plug, a 122 plug leading to a 301. You got to know all your numbers down there. But essentially, he wants to maintain tariffs as a cudgel. When March of last year came around, just before Mark Carney had been elected as the leader of the Liberal Party, Doug Ford and I were asked to go down and meet with Secretary Lutnick and with Jameson Greer. And the reason was, you may recall, the Premier decided that he might put a 25% tariff on electricity sold to the United States. And after a bunch of fairly rude calls from Secretary Lutnick, he got one that was rather obsequious and said, we'd like to politely ask you to reverse that 25% tariff, because that's how we heat our homes and things like that. And it's a little bit of national security. And the Premier, God love him, said, well, what's in it for me? And they said, well, we will reverse some tariffs that we're going to put in place. The Premier said, look, we just don't understand economically what you are trying to do. He worked in the United States for 20 years. The Premier worked in Chicago. He worked in New York. He's an amazing knowledge of the country. I love having him down there. We sat across the table from Lutnick, and Lutnick talked to us for about half an hour. And it was actually the really tuned in, smart Lutnick, not the guy you see on TV. And what he said effectively to us was this. He said, look, the United States is running a massive $38 trillion deficit or debt. We are adding to it by $1.8 trillion every year. It's not sustainable. It's terrible for the United States dollar as the currency of the world. And we need to address this. We're going to do four things to do it. The first thing is the big, beautiful bill, and it's going to make the problem worse. What we're going to do is keep taxes really low, so our revenues are going to be scarce. But that's really good for the promises of the president. The second thing we're going to do is, you remember the Doge. Elon Musk is going to come in and he's going to cut costs of government. And he was very open. He said, it's not going to make much of a difference, but oh boy, will our mega base love that. And third thing we're going to do is military spending. We have to carry the burden because you don't. You haven't done your military spending, and nor have other native countries for years and years and years. We can't afford it anymore. So we're going to make you do 2% spending so that we don't. And then number four is tariffs. And tariffs are going to do two things. Tariffs are going to provide a cudgel to the president to actually force countries to sit down, pay attention, and take care of some of those things that have been problematic for the United States, like our inability to sell American goods into their markets. Which is true. And the second thing is going to raise money. Now, you in Canada, you have the GST. Boy, that's stupid. That's the worst kind of political thing we could do. But you used to have a manufacturing tax. That's kind of what tariffs are going to be for us. It's a manufacturing tax. Yeah, they're going to be paid by American businesses. We know that. And it's going to raise billions. The president thinks it'll replace income tax. It hasn't quite worked out that way. The Supreme Court had some things to say about that, others. But that was a very helpful conversation to understand what was going through their heads, understand what was driving them. And from that, including things like artificial intelligence that they wanted to bring forward, needing more electricity, and then China cutting off critical minerals, and we have them all up there in the ring of fire. That gave us a basis for talking with them. So just before we get into some back and forth, where is it going? We're finally at this stage where we can sit down and we have a July 1st date for the renewal of the CUSMA. And every day there's a story out there about, somebody dissing somebody and whether or not we're behind or in front of the Mexicans or whatever. I'm not sure very much of that matters. But I do think that there is, and this is the good news, I think there's very much a deal that can be done. In fact, I think this year we can get a deal done if we want to, in the mutual self-interest of both the United States and Canada. And I think it very much is in the mutual self-interest. In fact, after the war in Iran, the high rise of diesel and gasoline prices, other inflationary pressures, General Motors paying $3 billion a quarter to pay for aluminum, so is Ford. All these things are really hard on U.S. industry. And I hear it in Congress every day when I'm up there meeting with people. And I think the one thing before the midterms for the president that could lift the American economy is a deal on CUSMA. And so instead of us doubling down on how bad everything is and how bad it could get, we actually need probably Donald Trump to start focusing on the benefit to his economy to get out of some of these holes that have been created. And it's actually real that he can do that in many ways. And so I think I see a start of a shift in the conversation. In this deal, they do not want to go to Congress that is constitutionally responsible for trade. Why? Because they don't want to open it up and have everybody mucking around in that CUSMA agreement. So what I think is going to happen, and you'll hear them talking about this, is what Jameson Greer refers to as sort of bolt-on side agreements, one for Canada, one for Mexico, that will address what I call the Festivus, the Jerry Seinfeld Festivus list of grievances. We raise your tariffs. We do that without asking you, and then we offer to reduce them if you will take action on our Festivus list. And we know what the list is. It's dairy and digital and things like that. And the federal government has the hard job. They have to make decisions on what they're willing to do. And we have an incredibly competent lead for that now in Janice Charette, who I couldn't think of a better person in the federal government background to solve problems. And we have a new ambassador, Mark Wiseman, who has a tremendous Rolodex, who can talk to American business. Americans talking to Americans can make this difference as we go forward. So what I see, bolt-on agreement for Canada, very possible. Dealing with those issues, yes, a lot of them are, including some issues for auto. But we can't just renew that. We also need to deal with these pernicious second bucket of things, which is these 232 tariffs. And those are 25% tariffs on auto, 50% on steel, 50% on aluminum, on copper, and a variety of other things, adding to the burden of forest products. And so that's what we want back. We would like to see minimally a unique competitive advantage over everybody in the world in terms of the tariff rates for what we send into the United States. We would love to get them back to zero. I'll be direct and frank. I don't know that we ever get back to zero. But in the world of competitive trade, if you are better than everybody else, you just have to outrun the guy who's running out the bear. And you guys know what I'm talking about. So I see that as a possibility, but they will be very difficult to resolve those things. The president's very dug in, especially on automotive and things. But then there's three things that could close this deal. One is those critical minerals that I mentioned, because you can't run the U.S. military without things like nickel. There is no nickel in the United States. It's all up in Sudbury and the new Crawford mine that's opening up there, and we process it there. They can't really build the infrastructure system without copper, and it's up there in the Ring of Fire. And they can't put wings on their fighter jets without titanium, and they can't do chrome plating on things without chromium, and it's all up there. And then the only other supplier of uranium other than Canada is Russia. That's a bit of a problem. And so all those things really, to me, give me confidence that in their self-interest, a deal on those things, add into it some kind of agreement on energy and critical minerals. Two other things, defense spending. We'll have a big debate, and it's in the federal government's purview to decide what planes do we want to buy, what kind of military decisions do we want to make. But that's a decision that will be very, very important to the president. And one last thing, and that is foreign direct investment. So I used to work at Manulife. Our insurance funds and money added to the pensions that we all have invested in the Canadian Pension Fund is in the trillions of dollars in the United States. And our money is invested 2 or 3 times more in the United States than it is in Canada, because that's where you get a good return. And so we have more money invested as Canadians in the United States than anyone else. When you see these wonderful deals that were signed with Japan and South Korea, and he's talking about $500 billion of new investment in the United States, we put that into the United States just in the turnover of the investment that we put in pensions. All those things together are a win for Donald Trump, and they're an enormous win for us. And let me just finish my comment saying, the one thing that I find in this experience is that as we separate noise from signal, we shouldn't be lumping together Donald Trump with Americans. Americans are great people. Americans are the people that are incredibly entrepreneurial. Americans are my sister who lives in Connecticut. Americans are our neighbors, and they are the most resilient people on the planet Earth. They took along Jeremy Hansen on the other side of the moon as well. And so we shouldn't forget that there's a lot of good in America, and there'll be a day after Donald Trump. So we need to have a longer look at these things. And with that, I'll turn it over to some Q&A.
You can see now why David is a regular guest on Power Play and Power and Politics, because he is great at demystifying what is going on in Washington for a Canadian audience, and telling us what we should care about and what we shouldn't care about. And that's one of the things I wanted, you and I were talking about before. How do you separate the news from the noise? I mean, we're going to talk about the media's role in trade talks, but how do you do that? Because there's the Truth Social is basically a one-man band, literally, of news stories and news cycles.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I do is don't really follow Truth Social very much. I get people that inevitably send me, "Did you see what he said last night?" And I'll quickly decipher, does that have to do with trade in Canada? If it doesn't, I really do care deeply about what's going on in Iran, and I'm I'm really shocked at some of the things that are out there, but I just have to be able to focus on what I do. And I think that's part of my business career that has helped me to do that. And funny enough, even the people working for Donald Trump do that. And they say so. They say, you have to separate out his superpower, which is to be the center of attention every single day. And we need to get our jobs done at the same time as well. And so, you go and you build your relationships. Some of the people I first met in Congress as staffers are now chiefs of staff to Jameson Greer and to Lutnick. And you go into these meetings and, oh, hi Dave, hi, and it starts to close in and be a little bit easier to deal with. There are good people, there are smart people, and I have to pay them the respect of understanding they have a sovereign capability of making their own decisions. And they'll always say, look, he got elected. I've had senators, Republicans. I've met with over 120 Republican senators and House members in the last year or so. I have not had a bad meeting with a Republican. And to a person, they say, look, we love Canada. I'm sort of embarrassed that we're doing this, but he got elected and it's his agenda. And we will stand with him to take that through. But we will push back. And when it comes time to do that deal, I'll be with you. Now, he doesn't want to bring it into Congress, but that's the kind of conversation that's actually taking place.
And it's David and I love the CJF so much that we actually arranged for Jameson Greer to be at Congress today, and Mark Carney to be talking about trade, Doug Ford to be talking about trade. So trade is back on the front burner. All joking aside, it really is. And I think is it because we're headed toward that July 1st deadline for CUSMA?
Yeah, I think so. It is true that that Jameson Greer and his staff have been in Mexico. And they have been working with Mexico, as they've been working with Canada, frankly, for a good long time. Mexico has triggered the formal kind of process of discussing the CUSMA renewal. But keep in mind that Festivus list that I was talking about is much, much longer for Mexico than it is for Canada. I mean, it's a dozen big issues for Canada. And frankly, I think many of them can be resolved if we choose to resolve them. Mexico is tough. They've got cartels, they have border issues, they have some legacies of the previous president in terms of oil ownership and other things that are really hard issues for them to deal with. I think Sheinbaum has been amazing at how she has handled the whole thing. I spent a whole day last week at the Meridian Conference with the Mexican negotiator and the heads of Mexican business organizations. Fascinating to talk to them, but they're just focused on their side of the bolt-on agreement. And then at some point, some of those things like changes to rule of origin, if you really want to get pedantic, I can go into that. But some of them will have to cross over as being things. But they don't want to open up the USMCA because they don't want it to go into Congress, because then everybody will want to add a chapter.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a very good point. It is ironic, of course, that CUSMA was signed by a president named Donald J. Trump 6 years ago. David Frum, the Canadian commentator who knows lots about America and lives there half the time, says that time is on our side in terms of Canada because Trump is only going to get more politically weakened in the days, weeks, months ahead. The midterms, the war that's not going particularly well, affordability crisis. You're on the ground in Washington, David. Do you see that? Is his power diminishing?
Well, I think one thing after that. Let me put it this way. I will tell this story from the words of a Republican member of the House of Representatives from Illinois a week or so ago, and said, how do you find it in the district in terms of the response to the Trump agenda, starting with tariffs? He said, oh, well, I'm mostly farm district, so I'm not really getting too much, but they're worried that tariffs might start to creep into some of the stuff. We've had a real hard time with China and them buying our products, et cetera. You are our very best customer in Canada. We started to get really starting to get worried about tariffs in some of the other areas like aluminum, et cetera. A little bit nervous on that. Then this Epstein thing comes up, and it's driving us crazy. And so then they double down on the immigration file, and then we got Minneapolis. And that really hurt their numbers in the Republican side. And again, this is a Republican saying this to me. And lo and behold, he didn't use the expression wag the dog, but we're into Iran. And so it's like one thing after another. It's very hard to keep up with. It's flooding the zone, as they say, with Steve Bannon expression. We used to use it in football. And so it's hard to keep up with. But I think right now we're at the stage where people in the White House are realizing that doing a deal on the USMCA is actually the one thing that can lift in a positive way the American economy, just as it would us. But the key thing for me is that delay, I hear the strategy, I hear some of it out of Ottawa. But that doesn't work if you're from Hamilton or Sault Ste. Marie, or if you're from Oshawa or Brampton or Ingersoll or other places that are just getting the you know what kicked out of them right now because of these 25% or 50% tariffs. It's really hard. It's even harder, ironically, for the people that are buying their products in the United States and paying the tariff. But it's leading to layoffs. It's leading, especially in the steel industry, it's really tough. So can I stand around and wait for that as the rep from Ontario? Hell no. Get to the table and let's get working.
Yeah, I mean, as Premier Ford often says about the F-150 is the best-selling truck in the United States, a Ford product. Sorry, I know you're a GM guy, but
I love them all now.
And that a big chunk of the cost of that truck is Quebec aluminum.
Yeah, it really does hurt, but a whole bunch of other problems. I've become good friends with a guy from Ohio, Republican. He is in the center of the RV business of America. This is a great part of this job. You get to meet these amazing businesses and the stories. But guess what RVs are made out of? Aluminum. You know, they did have aluminum factories in places like New York. Representative Taney from New York had a plant burned down. It was one of their big sources of aluminum. And I think, as Prime Minister Carney quite rightly said, I can't remember the number of Hoover dams that you would need to power aluminum production in the United States, but it's just not practical. It's not going to happen. So putting like a 50% tariff on aluminum, on your one source of aluminum, is about the dumbest thing I can think anybody could have done, but they've done it. So we'll take that because we can give that back later.
And one of the things that Jameson Greer was talking about today, and Prime Minister Carney's talked about it, Dominic LeBlanc's talked about it, is Ontario's ban on LCB. I mean, people in this room will know this. Ontario's ban on bourbon and California wines, all American booze, on the Crown liquor monopoly shelves, doesn't appear to have hurt Premier Ford's poll numbers. He was asked about it today at this at the Intersect conference, and he said, "It's an irritant, but it's a lever, and we're not going to give in on that one." Do you hear a lot about that in when you're down there as Ontario's man on the ground? You must.
Yeah, it's great. I get visited by the wine lobby, the bourbon lobby, the tequila lobby even comes in. I'm going to speak to the tequila guys next week. And so the lobbyists for California wine came in first, and they came in pretty hot, sort of saying, you know, this is like $1 billion that we're selling to you. It's actually 500 million in wine and about 500 million in spirits that the LCBO buys every year. Like, who knew we were the biggest buyer of alcohol in the world? But it must be the cold weather or something. But we made the decision. The premier made the decision, amongst other things. We did the electricity thing I mentioned. We've done some procurement things, but that definitely has got attention. So met with the lobbyists, and I said, look, so it's $500 million. And yes, I appreciate you're laying people off, and that's particularly tough. So here's what it looks like from our side of the border. We sell $50 billion of autos into the United States that you are tariffing now at 25%. And so which is bigger? And if you're in the province and you have that one area of trade, you're going to pull that tariff. Now, that booze will go back on the shelf the day we get these tariffs dealt with. And so why don't you help me go to the White House and suggest that we accelerate that deal so that we can start making business function again? And they went away, and then they came back 2 weeks later and they said, yeah, would you come and speak to our group in Congress? And they've helped in their own self-interest. The thing that will help us in this, that we have uniquely integrated with the United States, is American self-interest. That's what will win for this. And I like our hand in terms of the integration of our economies, because he hurts us, he hurts himself.
Yeah, one of the things that the premier was saying today as well was that Trump has done two good things. He's united Canada, and he's woken us up in the sense that we have to diversify our trade. Prime Minister Carney's doing that. In the States, are they aware? I know they're not happy about and you and I've talked about this before, the China EV deal that the Prime Minister signed with to bring 49,000 Chinese EVs into Canada. But are they cognizant of the fact that we are looking to India and looking to other markets, other emerging markets, because we can't be as reliant on what's happening with our American partners?
Well, you have to start answering that question with the old comment, which is very, very true. What do Americans think about Canadians in Washington? They don't. And so, but what does that mean? They're dealing with 150 other countries. You go to Congress and, you've got the guys coming out from Africa before you and people that are coming in from South America. They have a lot of things to solve. They've done 20 different deals since Liberation Day to reduce tariffs for countries around the world that were able to deal with their Festivus list. And they just decided it is better to deal with these issues and try and find a way so that we can get these tariffs down, get on with business. We have not done that. We're the only country other than China that retaliated against the United States. That did get their attention. And some of that has been given back in those types of things. But do they tune in? I think more so now because of the USMCA and Jameson Greer being in Congress. I watched it today because it was interesting to see all the people that I've met asking them questions. Very predictable, the issues for their districts. But I've looked those people across the desk and they're all saying, I'm really embarrassed about this. We got to get past it.
And I think that's a sense that Canadians feel the same way. I mean, what you and I were talking about before, what Canadian visits to the U.S. are down between 25 and 35%. That's a huge chunk of their tourism economy that they're not getting.
I got to I get asked to do these fly-in speeches down there. So we had 350 people from Las Vegas come in a couple of months ago. And so I was their dinner speaker, and they wanted to know, well, why are Canadians not showing up at the MGM and the Bellagio? And we're laying off Bellman, and, we're down 25% at the airport in terms of people coming in. We've got rooms that are empty. What is going on? And, the answer is yes, Canadians need to get things resolved. And it's not just our governments that are doing it. It's our citizens. They're voting with their feet. They're upset. And so, same thing I've said to the wine people. How about you come to the White House with me and make this case that we'd really like to fill up our rooms in Las Vegas? And they did. And so those are the kinds of things that we do. But it's not binary. This is the thing. When you do 75% of your trade with one company, yes, you're overexposed to that. But that is, $500 billion just for the province of Ontario. You can't move business that fast because trade is not about governments and it's not about even agreements. Even if you have the best zero tariff agreement, somebody's got to then make an investment. Somebody has to decide that they're going to set up distribution in another country. I'll tell you, and some of my friends from BlackBerry are here, setting up distribution in Indonesia or in Malaysia is not a piece of cake. And so it doesn't happen that quickly. So if we take the position that it's binary and we're going to diversify away from the United States, it's not going to happen. So we need to get a deal with them. They need to get a deal with us. We're their biggest market. Automobiles. We buy 3 times more, Canadians buy 3 more times more automobiles from the United States than does Mexico, Germany, or any other country. We have 40% of American exports are bought by Canadians. Japan buys 1%, Korea buys 2%. So we matter.
Now, you don't believe this, and I don't believe this, but just theoretically, what happens if CUSMA blows up and we get to Canada today, and the Gordie Howe Bridge doesn't open, and
Well,
we don't have a deal?
So we have a deal for, it's like a 15-year deal.
Yeah.
And the federal government's fond of saying recently to business, look, the worst thing that can happen is we end up negotiating for the next 10 years. It's not a cliff that we're at, it's a check-in point on things. And what I say back to my colleagues in the embassy is, what about those people in Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie? And so we need to do both. We need to both diversify, and that has been a gift. I mean, we're finally getting to do some things in Canada that we should have done a long time ago, and it's exciting and good to do that. That's why I get to watch you on TV to find out what the hell is going on up here, and then occasionally do these talks while we're trying to push things forward. So the time now between now and July 1st, I think we'll go into extra innings because, again, we're dealing with a special situation. So is Mexico. I believe we'll get there because the Americans will want it, and I think they'll want it before the midterms.
Because it could be that bleak for the Republicans.
It's just lift to the economy.
Yeah.
We focused on the negative for so long. It's really intriguing. I went to my friends at the U.S. Chamber last week, and I said, you guys have got the best studies on how terrible it will be. Why don't we do a study on how good it could be and then have the pollster to Donald Trump put it on his desk?
And let him think it's his idea.
That would be good.
Now, Jenny's got the mic, and we're going to take a few questions from the audience, if anyone would like.
Dave, you mentioned that you have had discussions with as many as 120 Republican senators, I think you said, last year. Congressman,
Thanks.
has the subject that irritates every single Canadian, Canada as the 51st state, ever come up with them? And is this just a Donald Trump thing, or are any of the congressmen on board with that also?
I haven't met one that hasn't apologized, frankly, for it. But we joke about it. I shouldn't joke about things like that, but I always say I'm tempted to ask, how many electoral college votes would we get? Especially with Republicans.
Yeah, Kevin Kramer says, Senator Kramer often jokes about, we joked with us when we were in Washington about how it would be deep blue state with a lot, bigger than California, with a lot of electoral college.
But just, you mentioned Senator Kramer. It's a great example. Canadians might not know who he is, but he was the first senator to come out for Donald Trump. He speaks regularly with Donald Trump. He doesn't speak to everybody, and there are 450 members in the House, etc. He's one of those, and yet, they make farm equipment in Fargo, and their biggest customer is Canada. They're an agricultural state. I had his chief of staff up here in 3 days in Toronto with the other trade lawyers in Congress to meet the premier and to learn more about Ontario. Those are pretty good allies, and he said, when it comes down to it, where I'll stand. Yeah, there are many things that the president says all the time to go back to the art of the deal, and so you got to separate noise from signal. You have to make some judgments, and then every once in a while he'll pull a Venezuelan and he'll surprise you. So you can never, the famous taco comment and everything like that. You give him the respect of the fact that he's elected as president. He came in with an agenda that people voted for, so we need to understand it, but it wasn't. Again, that's an example of how sometimes people try and get you riled up to get things said. You might talk to the guy behind you and you'll know that.
Jenny, you have.
What do you think will happen the day after Trump, be that at the ballot box or however it may happen?
What will happen to him the day after? Well, I think the day after the midterms, which will be so the midterms take place in November, and then people actually will change office in January. And when that happens, the House is likely at the moment to become Democrat led. When that took place and Trump won, we had all the investigations, we had impeachment. And the president himself has said, I don't want to lose the midterms because it'll be almost impossible to get anything done in Congress, no legislation, because I can't get it through the House if I lose the House. That's why they're doing gerrymandering in Texas. That's why yesterday, Virginia and a bunch of Democrats decided to strike back like California had done. So it's really sad. I mean, if I could do one great wish for my American friends, it would be to let's get money out of politics down there and get back to actually debating real issues. There's so many of these kind of, if I win this and all of that. But he is really motivated to get as much done this year as he can. And we've got the 250th anniversary of the United States coming up on July 4th. We'll have road racing in Washington. He's building an arch that's 100 feet higher than the Arc de Triomphe, putting a ballroom in place. There's a lot of things going on.
Well, do you think the Gordie Howe will open on Canada Day?
Yeah, the Gordie Howe, I think will actually, there's a date to open without a lot of fanfare. It will open. But there are issues that they've had to kind of work through. And this is, again, it's the art of the deal. I'm going to get your attention, and then we're going to sit down and work some things through. You just don't want to repeatedly be doing that. And that's why, for instance, we'll wait on things like the LCBO until we get things done.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Bukhari. I'm from the Bangladeshi community. I'm a journalist. I'm wondering because you gave lots of hope about tariff bring down to zero, and also Robert Benzie also mentioned Canada losing its power, diminishing its power. So I recall one article, one cover story in the Time magazine 2003. Would anyone notice if Canada disappeared? Whether you have seen it or not, they prominently focus Canada's soldiers number 80,000 to 60,000 reduced down, and also Canada shut down additional diplomatic missions, but they added 139 staffers. So, based on current context of Donald Trump's protectionism and the tariff imposition and the hope you are giving us, uh, how do you see, based on that 23 years ago, whether we are actually uh, disappearing from the world aspect, like Kearney is saying trade diversification and all diversification, since America was the major trade partner?
Well, we're not going to disappear. We're not going to be the 51st state. And I feel deeply in my bones certain that that is the case. We have some very threatening types of things that have been put our way. I think we are benefiting from the investments we're making in defense, in big projects. Should have done it long ago. I'm glad we're doing it. But we need to do both. We need to find a way to, whether it's now or eventually with our American partners, to get back. Someone asked me at an event last night, if you had to, there was a poll recently, do Canadians think China or the United States is a more trustworthy partner? And they voted for China. And I was asked, if you had to pick between the United States and China for your security, who would you pick? And I said, I just can't even believe I'm being asked the question. I mean, I've worked in China, and I know American security is what we need in North America. We call it, the Premier calls it Fortress North America, Fortress AMCAM. And yes, we can have a relationship with China, we can trade with China, but it's a big old nasty world out there. And I would not have anyone better than the United States at my side if things are problematic. That's just me. I'm speaking for myself on these things, but I think we have to keep some perspective on it. I don't want to be Pollyannish on these things, but I'm giving you my view from Washington on it. I think we have to have some hope, and we have to make our own outcomes on this stuff.
And David, you make the point about China. I mean, we have Michael Kovrig being very outspoken right now about the deal, the EV deal that Prime Minister Carney has signed, having been incarcerated in China unjustly for years. So I think, yeah, I can't believe that Canadians that question would be posed to people.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we have some differences in the House here
Yeah.
in Canada. We in Ontario, and certainly everyone in the auto sector, thought that that was a mistake to bring in Chinese EVs. I'll tell you, in Washington, they certainly think it's a mistake because in Washington, every serious conversation begins and ends with national security. It's something we're not used to here in Canada. It's certainly not in my lifetime. That's not in all my lobbying for different companies. Yeah, you know, General Motors, we even started up GM Defense here, but it was not a thing. In the United States, it is. And it's the burden of being the policeman of the world. You know, right now, there is nobody like China as the national security threat that's there. So one of the key speed bumps that we'll watch closely is the May 15th visit to with President Xi in China.
Yeah, I mean, because people forget that it was the Canadians added the 100% tariff to match Joe Biden's 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. It was Trudeau and Biden in cahoots.
Yeah.
And people forget that. And of course, Doug Ford was very supportive of that.
Yep.
Yeah. Kelly, go ahead.
This is a little different. It's me asking a question that Rob's on stage. It's usually the other way around back in the day. So years ago, about 2003, I want to say, I was working at a newspaper in northern British Columbia, and the U.S. decided to bring in tariffs to softwood lumber, quite significant tariffs, putting a lot of British Columbians out of work. And I wrote a column at the time saying that I would forego buying U.S. products if I could while the tariffs were in place. We're 23 years later, I still forego buying U.S. products. And that was one incident back then, one person writing a column. Do you have the feel that Canadians are going to return to buying American products? I don't think it'll ever come back to the level that this idea that we are just going to turn around and start buying American again.
I mean, some of the data that I've seen is interesting because it's age and demographic oriented in terms of the proclivity to make those kinds of buying decisions, whether it's walking up and down the grocery aisle or at the in the restaurant or what have you. But it's one of the things I mentioned earlier, talking with the wine industry, and it's, you know, I'm meeting the CEOs of some very big wine companies out of California and Washington State, and you know, I said it's not why I want you to come and help me solve this problem is that while we do this, I mean, if we put the booze back on the shelf, I don't know who would buy it right now. And your brands is what I would worry about as a business person. Your brands are getting killed for the long term. And I had the same discussion with the hotels in Las Vegas. I said, you know, if I were you, this is just my suggestion. You're complaining that 25% of your Canadian travel is down. What would I do? Well, you know, maybe it's you should think about hugging a Canadian. Do you know any Canadians? You ever heard of like Celine Dion or Cirque du Soleil? You're in Las Vegas. You know, there's this guy Rich Little once. You know, why don't you celebrate Canadians because you want to protect your brand? And why don't you reach over this trade battle that's taking place and sponsor TIFF or do something in Canada to say that when this resolves, we have your room ready. And some of them actually thought that wasn't a bad idea. And it, again, helps to separate out the interests of businesses. And I've spent my whole career in business, and we're looking at the quarter and the bottom line in doing these things. On softwood lumber, I've just had the CEO of our largest timber company down in my office last week. And they're doing some, I think, really creative things. We have a $10 billion escrow now from the collected tariffs that have taken place on those timber things. And what they're saying is, look, Those are all parked. Nobody can get our hands on that. Why don't we put that into building housing and drop the tariffs and get on with life? There's an example of a industry that's saying, I can't wait for government to solve my problems. I've got to come up with some nifty solutions. And I'll tell you, there's some thinking like that in the auto sector right now as well, because they're not going to take this idea of no cars being made for Americans in Canada. I mean, because we would close down their entry into our market. I mentioned how big a market we have. So what does that mean? There's the equivalent of 3 to 4 auto factories of workers that would be out of work if you couldn't send American cars up to Canada. So what would it be for to shut down the trade the other way? We sometimes have to remind Secretary Lutnick and the president that trade has got 2 lanes on the bridge. It goes in 2 directions. So a lot of it is sharing that data, but to me, it's Americans talking to Americans. If I walk in and say that, oh, he's self-interested, he just works for Doug Ford. No, if I bring somebody from the forestry industry, if I bring somebody from the auto sector, a little company like General Motors is here to see you, and they would like to continue doing trade with Canada. They want to fill up. They want to fill up their factory in Brampton. They want to fill up the factory in Ingersoll. I know for a fact they do. I know they have products to do it. We have billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars of investment that is ready to go in Ontario if we can get this stuff done. So we've got to get this thing done.
I think we have time for one more question. At the back.
Hi, I'm Nikhil from the Toronto Star. Hi, Rob. Thank you for the insightful discussion and your comments. I think I'm going to sort of try to shift this paradigm a little bit to the national security view and perhaps ask you, just this week, we've had an investigation published by my colleague in Calgary, Alex Boyd, about how there's a shady network of YouTube channels that are poisoning the minds of Albertans to break away from this country. I think the question I'm looking to ask is, are we being naive? Is Canada being naive about the bad actors in the United States whose apparently job it is every day with institutional backing to wake up and try and undermine the sovereignty of this country? And are we perhaps too focused on the short-term, trade negotiations and things of that nature? And, are we missing the more sinister stuff?
Well, first of all, I can tell you from my life in Blackberry, there is a lot of sinister stuff out there, and we absolutely should be worried. Are they in the United States? Maybe some, but I'll tell you, they're not all in the United States. It's absolutely certain that out of everywhere from Nigeria to Russia to whatever, we're dealing with misinformation, and that's a whole other J talk. So we'll chalk that one up. But the Alberta one. So I'm in the embassy. I'm a tenant in the embassy. I'm right next door to Alberta. And a really super guy named Nathan Cooper, who was the Speaker of the Alberta Legislature. And so their interest in Alberta is kind of different than ours. We're getting pummeled in the auto sector and in the steel sector. The price of oil just skyrocketed. And I mean, they're practically wiping out their deficit and everything and just counting their money in Alberta. And so you can imagine that the interest on those things are different. And yet, we are dealing with a separatist movement and all those types of things. So they're struggling with this too. One of the questions I asked is, we're always explaining our Canadian Constitution and the ownership of natural resources. Has anybody explained to the folks in Alberta that want to join the United States that the revenues for their oil would go to the federal government?
Thanks so much, David. You can see why journalists have David on speed dial. He is great at explaining things to us in a way that we can understand. And journalists we have a very low level of understanding a lot of the time. So, and Natalie, over to you.
On behalf of the CJF, please join me in thanking David Paterson and Rob Benzie. This was a candid and smart and illuminating conversation, and one that has given us a lot to think about. This is exactly why the CJF was created 36 years ago, to foster this kind of dialogue and to champion the journalism that makes it possible. I am now the only thing standing between you and a glass of wine. So I am going to invite you to stay in this room, continue the conversation, and join us for our reception. Thank you again for being with us tonight.